My name is Margaret Holloway, and I am 72 years old. 15 days ago, my son slapped me across the face in my own kitchen because I asked his wife not to smoke near my oxygen machine. 15 minutes later, someone knocked on my front door, and by the end of that evening, my son was sitting on my porch with his head in his hands while 2 police officers stood beside him asking questions he could not answer. But to understand how we got there, you need to understand something about my son Daniel. You need to understand how a little boy who used to cry when birds flew into windows became a man who raised his hand to his mother over a cigarette. Sunday dinners used to be sacred in our family. My husband Frank started them in 1978, the year Daniel turned 6. Every Sunday at exactly 5 p.m., the family sat around the dining room table no matter what was happening in life. Birthdays, promotions, arguments, funerals, heartbreaks, none of it mattered. Sunday dinner happened anyway. Frank used to say, families drift apart one missed meal at a time. He died 8 years ago from pancreatic cancer. But I kept the dinners going because some promises continue after the people who made them are gone. Daniel came most weeks. My granddaughter Emma came whenever her soccer schedule allowed it. My grandson Noah preferred video games to roast chicken, but showed up anyway because Emma made him. And then, 3 years ago, Daniel married Ashley Turner, and the air in the room changed in ways I could never quite explain. Ashley was beautiful, in the way magazine covers are beautiful. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics company downtown, and wore expensive perfume that lingered in rooms long after she left them. At first, I tried very hard to like her. I bought the tea she mentioned enjoying one time in passing. I learned how to make a pasta dish she liked from a restaurant near her office. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, promotions, little details that mothers collect, because collecting details is one way of loving people. Ashley noticed none of it. She was not cruel exactly. Cruelty takes effort. Ashley simply behaved as if other people were furniture that occasionally spoke. The first sign came 6 months into the marriage when she lit a cigarette in my sunroom during Thanksgiving dinner. Frank had built that sunroom himself in 1987. Cedar walls, large windows facing the garden. It smelled like coffee and old books and the lavender sachets I tucked behind the cushions every spring. Ashley sat beside the window, crossed her legs, pulled a silver lighter from her purse, and lit a cigarette without asking. I remember staring at the smoke curling toward the ceiling fan Frank installed with his own hands. Daniel looked up from his plate and said nothing. I said, "Ashley dear, would you mind taking that outside?" Frank hated cigarette smoke in the house. She smiled politely and said, "Frank isn't here anymore though, is he?" Daniel laughed, actually laughed. I told myself she was nervous. People say foolish things when they are nervous. Then came Christmas. Ashley complained that my tree looked outdated because I still used ornaments Daniel made in elementary school. The year after that, she asked if I had considered downsizing because, and I quote, "Old houses become burdens eventually." Last year, she asked if I had updated my will recently because legal issues become complicated at my age. At my age, 72 sounds older when someone else says it. I live in the same house Frank and I bought in 1974. 3 bedrooms, white shutters, a maple tree in the front yard that turns bright red every October. The mortgage was paid off 12 years ago. I know every sound that house makes. The groan near the staircase in winter, the whistle the kitchen window makes during heavy rain, the soft creak in the hallway floorboards outside Daniel's old bedroom. Houses become family members if you live inside them long enough. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The doctors asked if I had smoked. I laughed. Never once. 40 years working in a textile factory was apparently enough. Tiny fibers, dust in the air. Decades of breathing things my lungs were never meant to hold. The doctor explained it gently. My lungs were tired. Breathing would become harder over time. I was given medication, inhalers, and eventually a small oxygen concentrator for bad days. Daniel cried in the hospital parking lot after the appointment. I remember him hugging me and saying, "I'm going to take care of you, Mom." I believed him because mothers are very good at believing old versions of their children still exist somewhere underneath the new ones. The Sunday it happened was warm for October, 58 degrees, light wind. The maple leaves had started falling onto the porch Frank built 25 years earlier. I made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and Emma's favorite peach cobbler. Daniel arrived at 4:47 p.m. Ashley arrived at 4:59. Exactly 12 minutes later than Daniel, because they had driven separately after an argument neither of them explained. Emma hugged me the moment she walked through the door. Noah asked if we still had vanilla ice cream for dessert before saying hello. Teenagers are wonderfully predictable. Ashley walked into the kitchen, kissed the air beside my cheek, and immediately opened a bottle of white wine without asking. Dinner was pleasant enough at first. Emma talked about college applications. Noah talked about baseball tryouts. Daniel complained about a new manager at work. Ashley spent most of the meal looking at her phone beneath the table. Then, halfway through dessert, she stood up and walked into the kitchen. A minute later I smelled it. Cigarette smoke. My stomach dropped immediately. Not again. I followed the smell into the kitchen and found Ashley standing beside the open back door with a cigarette between her fingers. Smoke drifted through the room toward the counter, where my oxygen machine sat charging for the night. Daniel stood beside her scrolling through emails on his phone as if nothing unusual was happening. I stopped a few feet away because my lungs had already started tightening. "Ashley dear," I said gently, "would you mind smoking outside? The smoke makes it difficult for me to breathe these days." That should have been the end of the conversation. Any reasonable person would have apologized and stepped onto the porch. Instead, Ashley rolled her eyes and took another drag. Daniel looked up from his phone. "Seriously?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" He shoved his phone into his pocket. "For once, can you stop making everything about yourself?" The room went quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. "Daniel," I said softly, "I only asked." "You always ask." His voice rose. "Do you know how exhausting it is? Every visit there's some new rule. Don't sit there. Don't wear that perfume. Don't smoke here. Don't leave shoes there." Emma and Noah appeared in the doorway behind me. I could feel them standing there without turning around. Ashley said nothing. She simply watched. "This is my house," I said quietly. Daniel laughed once, sharp and humorless. "There it is. What does that mean? You always pull that card. My house? My rules. Your generation thinks owning property makes you royalty." I stared at him because suddenly I did not recognize his face anymore. The shape was familiar. The voice was familiar. But the person standing in front of me felt like a stranger wearing my son's expression. "Daniel," I said carefully. The doctor was very clear about cigarette smoke and my lungs. Ashley exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "Maybe if your lungs are that fragile, you shouldn't have guests over." Emma actually gasped. Noah looked at the floor. I felt something inside me go very still. "Ashley," I said. "I'm asking politely." Daniel stepped forward. "Then stop asking." His voice echoed through the kitchen. "Ashley is my wife. She doesn't need permission to exist comfortably." I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I said the sentence that changed everything. "Daniel, your father would be ashamed of this conversation." His face changed instantly. Not sadness. Anger. Pure anger. "Don't use Dad against me. I'm not using him against you. You always do this. His voice cracked through the room like thunder. "You act like you're some saint because Dad died and you're sick and old and everyone has to walk around you like you're made of glass." The words hurt more than I expected because some small part of me still believed he didn't mean them. I opened my mouth to answer. Instead, I started coughing. Deep coughing. The kind that grabs your chest and refuses to let go. I reached for the counter to steady myself. My oxygen machine sat less than 3 feet away. Ashley looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. Daniel did not move. When the coughing finally stopped, I looked up and said quietly, "Please take the cigarette outside." Ashley looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. Then my son stepped forward and slapped me across the face. Not hard enough to knock me down. Hard enough to turn my head sideways. Hard enough for Emma to scream. Hard enough for the room to become perfectly silent. My cheek burned instantly. Daniel stood frozen as if he could not quite believe what his own hand had done. Then Ashley smirked. Just slightly. Just for a second. But I saw it. And then Daniel said the sentence I will hear for the rest of my life. "Shut up." His voice was shaking. "You stink worse than smoke anyway." 15 minutes later, there was a knock on my front door. 3 slow knocks, and when I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch, asking if I was Margaret Holloway, because someone in the neighborhood had reported a possible case of elder abuse. The police officers introduced themselves as Officer Ramirez and Officer Collins. mid-30s, calm voices, the kind of people who had walked into enough broken homes to know that the quiet ones were often the worst. Officer Ramirez looked at my cheek first, not my eyes, not Daniel. My cheek. The skin was already turning pink where his hand had landed. "Mrs. Holloway," he said gently, "we received a call from a neighbor reporting shouting and a possible assault. Are you all right?" Daniel stepped forward before I could answer. "This is a misunderstanding." Officer Collins held up a hand without looking at him. "I'm asking your mother, sir." My mother. Not the old woman, not the homeowner. My mother. Strange how powerful simple words become when spoken by strangers. I looked past the officers toward the house across the street. Mrs. Henderson's curtains moved slightly. 81 years old, widowed, retired school librarian, and apparently still the fastest woman in Maplewood when it came to calling the police. God bless her for it. "I'd like to speak to Mrs. Holloway privately," Officer Ramirez said. Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. "That's not necessary." Officer Collins finally looked at him. "Actually, it is." Emma stepped beside me then. 16 years old, brown hair, Frank's eyes. "I saw what happened," she said quietly. The room changed immediately. Daniel turned toward her so quickly I thought he might shout again. Instead, he simply stared. "Emma!" She looked terrified. She also looked determined. Dad slapped Grandma. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Ashley crossed her arms and stared out the window. Officer Ramirez asked if we could talk in the dining room. I nodded. The dining room still smelled faintly of peach cobbler and cigarette smoke. Frank's photograph sat on the sideboard watching all of us with the same patient expression he had worn for 30 years. Officer Ramirez sat across from me at the table. "Did your son strike you tonight?" Such a simple question. Such a difficult one. Because answering yes would not just describe what happened. It would make it real. I looked down at my hands. Wrinkled hands. Factory hands. Grandmother hands. Hands that had held Daniel when he had nightmares about thunderstorms. Hands that packed school lunches and signed permission slips, and sat beside hospital beds. "Yes," I said quietly. "He did." Officer Ramirez nodded once and wrote something in a small notebook. "Has this happened before?" I thought about the question carefully. Not physically. Never physically. But disrespect arrives long before violence does. It grows slowly. Like mold behind walls. Invisible. Until suddenly it isn't. "No," I said. "Not like this." Meanwhile, Officer Collins was speaking with Emma and Noah in the living room. I could hear fragments through the doorway. "What did you see? Did anyone threaten anyone? Has your father ever acted like this before?" Daniel and Ashley stood in the kitchen waiting. Ashley still held the cigarette between her fingers, although it had long since burned out. 15 minutes earlier she had looked amused. Now she looked irritated. Like the evening had become inconvenient. Elder support services. 24-hour hotline. Counseling resources. Legal resources. I stared at the card for a moment before slipping it into my sweater pocket. Daniel saw it immediately. His face darkened. "Mom, you're not actually doing this." Doing this. As if I had slapped myself. Officer Collins explained that because visible injury was minor and I was declining to press charges, no arrest would be made that evening. But a report would be filed. Daniel looked relieved immediately. Too relieved. Like a student hearing the exam was cancelled. Then Officer Collins asked one final question. "Sir, what do you do for work?" Daniel blinked. "I'm a project manager for North Star Defense Systems." The officers exchanged a look so brief, most people would have missed it. I didn't. North Star held government contracts, security clearances, behavioral requirements. Violent incidents had consequences in industries like that. Daniel saw the look too. "Why does that matter?" Officer Collins simply said, "Good evening, sir." The officers left at 7:48 p.m. The house felt different after the door closed behind them. Smaller somehow. Quieter. Daniel turned toward me immediately. "You embarrassed me." I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the sentence was so absurd my brain rejected it. "Daniel, you hit me. And now there's a police report." Ashley finally spoke for the first time in almost 10 minutes. This could affect his clearance. There it was. Not your health, not your feelings, not what happened. The clearance, the job, the inconvenience. Emma looked at her mother in disbelief. Grandma couldn't breathe. Ashley shrugged. Actually shrugged. She was exaggerating. Emma stood up so quickly her chair nearly fell over. No, she wasn't. The room went silent again. My granddaughter looked around at all of us with tears in her eyes. I was standing right there. Daniel opened his mouth. Emma cut him off. You hit your mother because she asked someone not to smoke in her own house. Frank would have been proud of her in that moment. Terrified, shaking, but standing anyway. Daniel looked away first. Noah still hadn't said a word. 15 years old, and staring at the floor like maybe if he didn't move, this would become someone else's family. Eventually, Ashley grabbed her purse. We're leaving. Daniel hesitated. For 1 second, I thought maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would look at me and see what he had done. Instead, he said, call me when you're ready to stop overreacting. Overreacting. I touched my cheek where his hand had landed. Good night, Daniel. He looked almost disappointed by the answer. They left 3 minutes later. The front door closed softly behind them. Emma stayed. Noah stayed too. We sat in the living room without speaking for almost 10 minutes. Finally, Noah looked up and asked the question none of us wanted to say out loud. Is Dad in trouble? I looked at Frank's photograph above the fireplace. I don't know. Emma moved beside me on the couch and took my hand. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. I'm sorry. Such a strange thing for a child to apologize for. I squeezed her hand gently. None of this belongs to you. She started crying anyway. Around 9:15 p.m., the house finally became quiet. Emma and Noah were asleep in Daniel's old bedroom because neither of them wanted to go home with their parents that night. I understood. Some houses stop feeling safe all at once. I was making tea when my phone rang. Daniel, I let it ring 6 times before answering. Mom, his voice sounded different now. Less angry, more afraid. What is it? Silence. Then, my supervisor called. I said nothing. Security compliance was notified about the police report. There it was. The first consequence. Small compared to what had happened, but real. They're suspending my clearance review until the investigation is finished. Investigation. Such a frightening word when you've spent your life assuming someone else will protect you from outcomes. Mom, you need to tell them this was a misunderstanding. I looked out the kitchen window toward Frank's maple tree moving in the wind. Was it? Silence. Long silence. I was angry. You were violent. More silence. Then the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. Ashley says you're punishing me. Ashley says. Not I think. Ashley says. Even now his compass pointed somewhere else first. Daniel, I said quietly. Actions punish people. Consequences just arrive afterward. He hung up without saying goodbye. I washed my teacup and turned off the kitchen light. As I walked toward the hallway, I noticed Frank's photograph again. Smiling beside the fishing boat he loved. Flannel shirt, baseball cap, sun in his eyes. You were supposed to help me with this part, I whispered to the empty room. The house creaked softly around me. Winter settling into old wood. Upstairs, Emma coughed in her sleep. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice. And for the first time since Frank died 8 years earlier, I felt truly alone inside the house we built together. The next morning at exactly 8:12 a.m., my doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't the police. It was a man in a gray suit holding a folder with North Star Defense Systems printed across the front. And suddenly I realized last night had not been the end of the story. It had only been the first consequence. The man standing on my porch introduced himself as Mr. Stephen Ward from Human Resources at North Star Defense Systems. Mid-50s, gray suit, polished shoes, the kind of face that had delivered difficult news often enough to know there was no graceful way to begin. Mrs. Holloway, he said carefully, may I come in for a few minutes? I stepped aside. He sat in Frank's old armchair while I made coffee. Neither of us touched. The house felt too quiet without Emma and Noah. Their school started at 8, and I had driven them myself, because neither child wanted to ride in the same car as their parents that morning. This visit is unofficial, Mr. Ward said. Daniel doesn't know I'm here. That got my attention immediately. Why are you here then? He folded his hands carefully. Because I've known your son for 15 years. I waited. And because people don't usually wake up one day and strike their 72-year-old mother over a disagreement about smoking. The room went silent. Frank's clock ticked softly above the fireplace. Mr. Ward slid a folder across the coffee table. Inside were documents I didn't understand at first. Incident reports, performance reviews, written warnings. Dates spanning almost 3 years. Daniel has been having problems at work, he said quietly. Temper problems. I looked down at the papers. An argument with a subcontractor 18 months ago. A shouting match during a project meeting 11 months ago. A formal warning after slamming a laptop hard enough to crack the screen 6 months ago. My stomach tightened. He never told me. Mr. Ward nodded slowly. Most people don't tell their mothers these things. He hesitated. His wife has attended several meetings with him. Ashley. Of course, Ashley. I thought back to the cigarette, the smirk. The way she watched instead of intervening. She encouraged him? Mr. Ward chose his words carefully. She often explained why his reactions were someone else's fault. I stared at Frank's photograph above the fireplace. Somewhere along the way, my son had learned that anger was something that happened to him instead of something he chose. Mr. Ward stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door he paused. For what it's worth, Mrs. Holloway, I think your son needs help more than punishment. I nodded slowly. Sometimes those are the same thing. He smiled sadly. Yes, sometimes they are. At 11:16 a.m., my phone rang. Ashley. I almost didn't answer. Almost. What did you tell North Star? No hello, no apology, straight to accusation. I didn't call North Star. Daniel could lose his job. There was genuine fear in her voice now. Not concern. Fear. Ashley, he hit me. Silence. Then, you embarrassed him in front of the kids. I laughed softly, because suddenly I understood something important. Ashley didn't see the slap as the event. She saw my reaction to the slap as the event. Cause and effect had reversed somewhere inside her head. Did you know he was struggling at work? I asked quietly. The silence lasted too long. Ashley? Everyone gets angry sometimes. There it was. Permission disguised as understanding. Did he ever hit you? The line went completely silent. Not offended silence, not angry silence, scared silence. My heart sank immediately. Ashley? That's none of your business. My stomach dropped. Ashley? Did Daniel ever put his hands on you? She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone for a very long time. At 1:42 p.m., Emma came home from school early. Red eyes, backpack hanging from one shoulder. I got sent to the counselor. She sat at the kitchen table while I made sandwiches neither of us wanted. Why? She looked down at the table. I punched a boy in biology. That surprised me enough that I forgot to speak. Emma had inherited Frank's gentleness. Violence looked unnatural on her the way snow looks unnatural on beaches. What happened? Her eyes filled immediately. He heard about Dad and started making jokes about grandma abuse. I sat beside her and waited. He said maybe you deserved it because old people complain too much. Her voice cracked. So I hit him. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked, did it make you feel better? She considered that honestly. No. Did it solve anything? No. Another pause. But for about 3 seconds I understood Dad. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Because anger spreads. It moves through families like electricity through water. If nobody stops it, eventually everyone starts speaking the same language. Emma, I said quietly, understanding something and excusing it are different things. She nodded slowly. I know. Around 3 p.m. there was another knock at the door. This time it was Officer Ramirez. He stood on the porch holding a notebook and wearing the same patient expression as before. May I come in? We sat in the dining room, where all difficult conversations in this family seemed to happen eventually. I spoke with your daughter-in-law this morning, he said. My chest tightened immediately. And? He looked down at his notes. Mrs. Turner mentioned that your son has never been physically violent before. That wasn't surprising. But she also mentioned that you and Daniel argue frequently about the house. The house. There it was. The real subject finally arriving. What kind of arguments? I asked carefully. Ramirez looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd met him. According to Mrs. Turner, Daniel and Ashley were hoping you might consider moving into assisted living sometime in the next year or two. I stared at him. Excuse me? He shifted slightly in his chair. Apparently they've discussed renovating the property after. He stopped himself. After I died. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. I looked around the dining room. Frank's dining room table. Frank's windows. Frank's house. The place where Daniel learned multiplication tables, and Emma learned to bake cookies, and Noah learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Renovating the property after. The sentence sat heavy in my chest. Did Daniel say this too? Ramirez nodded slowly. He mentioned concerns about your health and living alone. Concerns. Such a generous word for greed sometimes. After he left, I walked upstairs to Frank's old study. Most people thought the room was empty storage now. It wasn't. In the back of the closet sat a green metal box Frank bought in 1983. Inside were insurance papers, military records, tax returns, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front, in Frank's handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter dated 3 months before he died. Margaret, if you're reading this, then either I'm gone or the doctors were very wrong. Probably the first one. There were instructions about bank accounts and insurance policies, and practical things Frank always handled better than I did. Then near the end there was one paragraph that made me sit down. If Daniel ever starts confusing love with ownership, remind him that this house belongs to you, not to memory, not to inheritance, not to expectation. Homes are gifts while we're alive, not prizes waiting for us after someone dies. I read that paragraph 3 times. Frank knew. Somehow Frank had seen this possibility years before I had. At 6:07 p.m., Daniel showed up unannounced. Alone this time. No Ashley, no anger either, just exhaustion. He stood on the porch looking older than 43. Can I come in? I stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen where it happened. The same kitchen, the same table, different people somehow. I'm suspended, he said quietly. Paid leave until the investigation finishes. I nodded. I know. He looked surprised. How? Your HR department visited this morning. He stared at me. What? Mr. Ward seems worried about you. Daniel looked away immediately. Shame has a very recognizable posture once you've seen enough of it. Ashley thinks I should sue the police department. Of course she did. And what do you think? He was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, I don't know anymore. We sat there in silence. Finally he looked up at me. His eyes were red. Mom. His voice cracked on the word. When Dad died, I got so angry. I waited. Everyone needed something from me all the time. Ashley needed support. The kids needed stability. Work needed results. You needed help around the house. He rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't know what to do with all of it. I thought about that. About grief turning into responsibility, and responsibility turning into resentment if you're not careful. So you got angry. He nodded. And Ashley always told me I was justified. There it was again. Permission. Validation. The dangerous comfort of someone telling you your worst moments belong to someone else. Daniel, I said quietly, did you ever hit Ashley? He looked up so quickly I knew the answer before he spoke. No. Relief hit me immediately. Then he added, but I yelled. A lot. He looked around the kitchen. I don't know when I became someone Dad wouldn't recognize. Neither did I. The truth was, I wasn't sure there had been one moment. People don't become strangers overnight. They become strangers one excuse at a time. Eventually, Daniel looked at me and asked the question he'd been carrying all evening. Do you hate me? I looked at my son, the boy who collected frogs when he was 7 because he worried they were lonely in the garden by themselves. The teenager who cried when Old Yeller died even though he knew exactly what was coming. The man who slapped his mother because she asked someone not to smoke in her own house. No, I said honestly, but I don't trust you right now. The words hit him harder than anger would have. He nodded slowly. That's fair. He left 20 minutes later. At the front door he stopped and looked back at the house. Dad really loved this place, didn't he? I smiled sadly. He loved the people inside it more. Daniel nodded once and walked to his car. I watched him drive away from the front window Frank installed in 1985. For the first time in a very long time, my son looked less angry than lost. But what neither of us knew yet was that Ashley wasn't finished. Because the next morning, at exactly 9:03 a.m., she would arrive at my front door with a folder in her hand and an offer that would change everything. Ashley arrived at exactly 9:03 a.m. the next morning carrying a leather folder and wearing the same cream-colored coat she wore to church every Easter, despite never attending church herself. She stood on my porch with sunglasses on even though the sky was gray. For a moment she looked almost nervous. Then I remembered Ashley didn't really do nervous. Ashley did annoyed. Ashley did impatient. Ashley did offended. But nervous belonged to people who thought they might be wrong. "Can I come in?" she asked. I considered saying no. Instead, I stepped aside. Frank used to say that if someone wanted to show you who they were, you should give them enough room to do it properly. Ashley sat at the kitchen table and placed the folder between us, like she was about to close a business deal. No apology. No mention of Sunday night. No mention of the police or Daniel or Emma crying in the hallway. Straight to business. "Daniel doesn't know I'm here." "Interesting. What do you want, Ashley?" She opened the folder. Inside were photographs of retirement communities, brochures, floor plans, pricing sheets. Smiling elderly couples playing cards and gardening, and walking through perfectly landscaped courtyards. I stared at the papers for several seconds before looking back at her. What is this? An opportunity. I almost laughed. Opportunity. Such a beautiful word when you're selling something ugly. Ashley slid one brochure closer to me. Willow Creek Assisted Living has an opening next month. 2-bedroom suite. Medical staff 24 hours a day. I looked at the photographs again. Beige walls, beige furniture, beige lives carefully arranged to look like freedom. I'm not moving into assisted living. Ashley folded her hands. Margaret, after what happened Sunday, I think we need to be realistic. Margaret. Not Mom, not Mrs. Holloway. Margaret. Names become tools in conversations like this. Realistic about what? Your health. There it was. Always the health. Never the house behind the health. My doctor says I'm doing well. You're 72. Last time I checked, that wasn't a crime. Ashley exhaled slowly through her nose. The same expression she made when waiters brought the wrong order at restaurants. Daniel is under enormous pressure right now. Ah, there we are. Not my health. His pressure. And, the investigation, the suspension, the children being upset, she paused. It would help everyone if things became simpler. Simpler. Another beautiful word. I looked around my kitchen. Frank's kitchen. The curtains I sewed myself in 1998. The coffee mug with Emma's handprint from 2nd grade. The small crack in the tile near the sink where Daniel dropped a can of peaches when he was 11. Simpler for whom? Ashley, I said quietly. Are you asking me to leave my house because my son hit me in it? She actually looked offended by the question. Of course not. Then what are you asking? She was silent for 3 seconds too long. I'm asking you to think about the future. The future. Translation. After. After the house. After the inheritance. After me. Frank's letter flashed through my mind. If Daniel ever starts confusing love with ownership, do you know what my house is worth? I asked suddenly. Ashley blinked. What? The market value, she hesitated. Around 800,000 maybe? Too fast. Much too fast. She knew exactly what the house was worth. 874,000, I said. According to the appraisal last spring. Ashley looked away first. Interesting. Property values are doing very well in this area. Property values, not memories, not history. Property values. Did you know Frank built that porch himself? I asked. She frowned slightly. What? The porch. Took him 7 weekends. The railing still leans slightly to the left because he refused to admit he measured it wrong. Ashley said nothing. The maple tree out front was planted the week Daniel was born. Silence. The mark on the pantry door is from when Daniel crashed his bicycle into the house, trying to impress a girl named Melissa. More silence. This house isn't an investment, Ashley. I touched the kitchen table softly. It's a life. For the first time since she arrived, Ashley looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Just uncomfortable. Like the conversation had wandered into a language she didn't speak. Then she said something that explained everything. Daniel deserves stability after everything he's been through. I stared at her. After everything he's been through? The suspension, the investigation, the stress. I leaned back in my chair. Ashley, he slapped his 72-year-old mother. She crossed her arms immediately. Defensive position. You keep saying that like context doesn't matter. Context. The favorite word of people explaining behavior they would never accept from strangers. What context makes that acceptable? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out, because there isn't any. Eventually she stood up and closed the folder. I tried to help. No, she hadn't. She had tried to manage consequences. Very different things. At the door she stopped and looked back at me. For what it's worth, I don't think Daniel is a bad person. Neither did I. That was the problem. Bad people are easier to understand than damaged people. Bad people choose cruelty because they enjoy it. The damaged people choose cruelty because they've convinced themselves it's necessary. After she left, I walked upstairs to Frank's study again. This time I opened the green metal box and took out something I hadn't looked at in years. My will. 8 pages. Signed 6 years earlier after my diagnosis. The estate was divided equally between Daniel and a trust for Emma and Noah's education. Fair, simple, traditional. I read it twice. Then I called my attorney. Harold Benson had been handling our legal paperwork since 1989. Frank trusted him because Harold once returned an extra $20 after being overpaid by mistake. Frank admired people like that, Margaret. Harold sounded surprised to hear from me. I need to update my will. Silence. Is everything all right? I looked out the study window toward the maple tree. Half the leaves had fallen now. No, I said honestly. But I think it might be eventually. We met the following afternoon. Harold listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The slap, the police report, the house conversation, Ashley's brochures. When I finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Families can become very strange around money they haven't inherited yet. I nodded slowly. I don't want Daniel punished. What do you want? I thought about that carefully. Frank's photograph, Emma crying in the hallway, Noah staring at the floor, Ashley talking about opportunity while sitting in the kitchen, where my son hit me. Finally I said, I want my grandchildren protected from becoming this. Harold nodded once. 2 hours later, the paperwork was finished. The educational trust increased substantially. Donations added to the children's hospital, where Frank received treatment during his final months. Local veterans charities included, because Frank would have liked that. Daniel remained in the will, but not equally anymore. Harold looked at me before printing the final version. Are you sure? I thought about my son at 7 years old crying because he accidentally stepped on a snail in the garden. Then I thought about him at 43, telling his mother she smelled worse than smoke. No, I said honestly. I'm heartbroken. Harold nodded slowly. That's not what I asked. I signed anyway. That evening, Emma called me from her room. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart? Dad wants to know if he can come by tomorrow. I looked toward Frank's empty chair beside the fireplace. Of course he can. Because despite everything, some doors stay unlocked a little longer than they should. Not because people deserve it. Because hope is stubborn. The next afternoon, Daniel would walk through my front door, carrying something in his hands that I had not seen in almost 30 years. And for the first time since the slap, my son was finally going to understand exactly what he had broken. Daniel arrived the next afternoon at 3:14 p.m., carrying a cardboard box with both hands. For a moment I thought it might be more paperwork, more brochures, more solutions to problems nobody had asked him to solve. Instead, he placed the box gently on my kitchen table and stepped back. I found these in the garage. I looked inside. My breath caught immediately. Photographs, hundreds of them, some loose, some inside albums, some in envelopes with dates written in Frank's handwriting. Daniel at 6 holding his first fish beside the lake. Emma asleep on Frank's chest when she was 3 months old. Noah in oversized rain boots helping Frank rake leaves. Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, camping trips. Ordinary moments saved because Frank believed ordinary moments became important later. Right on top sat a photograph I had not seen in nearly 30 years. Daniel at age 9, sitting on Frank's shoulders, while I stood beside them laughing at something outside the frame. We looked impossibly young, impossibly safe. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long time. Dad kept this in his workshop. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. He wrote something on the back. I turned it over. Frank's handwriting. August 1990. My favorite people in the whole world. I looked up slowly. Daniel was crying. Not dramatic crying. Not loud crying. The quiet kind that escapes before you realize you're making it. I spent all week trying to figure out when I stopped being that kid. He pointed toward the photograph. The one Dad would have been proud of. I said nothing. Some questions are too heavy for quick answers. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table where it happened. The same table. Different people again. I remembered something yesterday. He rubbed his hands together nervously. Do you remember when I was 11 and I punched a boy at school because he pushed a girl off the swings? I nodded immediately. Mrs. Turner had called me at work. Daniel had cried all the way home because he thought Frank would be disappointed. Dad took me fishing that weekend. Daniel smiled sadly. He told me something I've thought about every day since Sunday. I waited. Daniel looked down at the photograph again. Being angry doesn't make you dangerous, he said. Believing your anger belongs to someone else does. Frank. That sounded exactly like Frank. Simple words carrying heavy truths. Daniel wiped his eyes. Ashley always told me my anger was justified. There was that word again. Justified. The most dangerous word in the English language when attached to cruelty. And what do you think now? He looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. I think I wanted someone to blame for how unhappy I was becoming. The room went quiet. Outside, wind moved through Frank's maple tree. Nearly bare now. Winter getting closer. And I think blaming you was easier than looking at myself. Honesty sounds different from apology. Apologies ask for something. Honesty offers something. Daniel reached into the box and pulled out another photograph. Me holding him as a baby in the hospital. 24 years old. Exhausted. Smiling like I had discovered fire. You know what scares me most? He asked quietly. What? Emma looked at me the same way I used to look at my father when he disappointed me. That one hurt because I understood exactly what he meant. Children don't stop loving you when you fail them. They stop believing you're who they thought you were. Sometimes that's worse. Daniel stayed for almost 2 hours. We talked about Frank, about work, about grief, about anger, about all the conversations families avoid, until avoiding them costs more than having them. Eventually he stood to leave. At the door he hesitated. I signed up for counseling. I smiled slightly. Good. Individual counseling. He paused. And anger management. Better. He nodded once. Ashley moved in with her sister yesterday. That surprised me less than it should have. Some marriages survive storms. Others discover they were built during the weather forecast. I don't know if we're getting divorced. You don't have to know today. He laughed softly at that. The first real laugh I'd heard from him in weeks. Before leaving, he looked around the house one last time. Are you staying? I knew what he meant immediately. The house. The brochures. The future everyone else seemed to have planned for me. I looked around the kitchen. Frank and I built our lives inside. The curtains, the pantry door, the photographs, the memories living in the walls like old music. For now, I said, homes aren't meant to outlive us forever. I touched the kitchen table gently, but they should outlive other people's plans for them. Daniel smiled. Frank would have liked that answer. Christmas arrived 6 weeks later, smaller than usual, quieter too. Emma made the mashed potatoes because she insisted mine were too lumpy. Noah burned the rolls because some traditions deserve protection. Daniel came alone and stayed the whole evening. At one point, I caught him staring at Frank's empty chair beside the fireplace. What? I asked. He shook his head slowly, just wondering what he'd say about all this. I thought about that for a moment. Then I smiled. Probably something annoyingly wise. Daniel laughed. Definitely annoyingly wise. After dinner, Emma handed me a small gift wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a wooden plaque with a quote carved into it. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Frank's handwriting. Emma had copied it from one of his old notebooks. Families don't break in one terrible moment. They break in small moments nobody repairs. Underneath she had added another line herself. So repair the small moments while you still can. I cried when I read it. Daniel cried too. Nobody pretended not to notice. Spring came eventually. It always does. Daniel kept going to counseling. The suspension ended after 3 months with mandatory behavioral review conditions attached to his position. Consequences stayed. So did accountability. That's how healing works sometimes. Not by erasing what happened, by refusing to let it happen twice. Ashley and Daniel separated officially in April. I never celebrated that. Marriages ending are sad, even when staying married would be sadder. Emma left for college in August. Noah discovered baseball and girls in almost equal measure. Life continued doing what life does best, moving forward whether we're ready or not. Last week I sat on the porch drinking tea while the maple tree dropped its first red leaves of the year. Emma called from university. Noah texted me a photograph of a fish he caught that was much smaller than he claimed. Daniel was coming for Sunday dinner. Real Sunday dinner. Just us this time. Before hanging up, Emma asked me something. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart? Were you scared after Dad hit you? I looked out at the yard. Frank spent 20 years trying unsuccessfully to make perfect. No. She was quiet for a moment. Really? I smiled softly. I was sad long before I was scared. Another pause. Then what scared you? I thought about that carefully. About police officers and cigarette smoke and brochures and photographs, and all the things families survive if they're lucky enough to notice the damage in time. Finally, I said, what scared me was realizing that if nobody stopped him, your father was going to spend the rest of his life believing his anger belonged to other people. Emma was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "Did he stop?" I looked toward the driveway where Daniel's car would arrive in a few hours. Toward the front door he now knocked on before entering. Toward the empty chair by the fireplace that somehow still helped raise all of us. "He's trying," I said. "Sometimes trying is the bravest thing a person can do." The truth is, my son did not become a bad man the night he slapped me, and he did not become a good one again afterward. People are rarely that simple. The night he raised his hand wasn't the day I lost my son. It was the day he finally met the consequences of becoming someone he didn't want to be. And 15 minutes later, when the police knocked on my front door, it wasn't the end of our family. It was the first time someone finally interrupted the silence before it became permanent. Sometimes love protects people from consequences. Real love doesn't. Real love stands in the doorway and says, "No further." Real love tells the truth even when the truth costs something, especially then. And if Frank taught me anything in 46 years of marriage, it's this. Families drift apart one missed meal at a time, but sometimes they find their way back one honest conversation at a time too.